Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to talk about current topics where boards seek and value general counsel's advice. And joining me is someone who has experience on both sides of the table, which I appreciate, is Don Haghighi, who's the general counsel for Murcor Real Estate and also serves on the board of Elevate Services. So welcome, Dawn.
Thank you, TK. I look forward to our discussion today.
I'm certainly not going to give you an easy one this time. As you know, it's been an unbelievable year. And I'm not just talking the pandemic, because we've also had a year of plenty of social issues which have hit the boardroom as well. We've seen shareholders sort of be pushing back, and institutional shareholders aren't afraid to vote no against boards who have proven not to be responsive to some of these issues or disclosure requirements that have been put on the table. So again, I'm happy to have you because you have experience on both sides of the table, both as a GC and as a director. And I want you to put on your GC hat for the moment. And so when we talk about things that they should seek the GC's advice, what first comes to your mind when you're wearing the GC hat?
Thank you, TK. And you're absolutely correct that 2020 brought about tectonic shifts worldwide and a redefinition of business as usual. And so in your intro comments where you're talking about the multiple pressures that are being placed on shareholders, I'm going to put that into context because that frames what I am going to look at as a GC. What is occurring right now, as you've mentioned, is a manifest shift in the balance of power between the shareholder and the stakeholder. And bottom line, corporations are rethinking their contract with society. And these pressures were brought about, they predated the pandemic, but were accelerated because of the social unrest, because of the pandemic, and they magnified the inequities in society. And what they've done is focused on the corporation to think about their responsibility in addressing these types of inequities. And so what that is, where that's taken us and where that then focuses me as a GC on my agenda is the growing recognition of environmental, social, and governance, ESG, and societal issues, which are now seen and taking much of the same importance in terms of sustainability and durability of the corporation as direct financial performance. These issues of ESG, societal issues, are really becoming a mainstay on the C-suite and the board's agenda. So it's with that backdrop that I look at, well, what do I need to do as a GC to support the board? First off, I am always looking to continue to build resiliency, the corporation remaining flexible and agile. So that's very important to me as I give legal advice to the company. Now, a key focus that I have as a general counsel is improving board efficiency in this new emerging world and mitigating risk oversight liability. And I'm going to first look at it in terms of what can I do to support the board chair and the CEO on the board agenda. The agenda has had significant and increased demands with new issues, in addition to just regular items that are on the board agenda, the strategic items, because of the pandemic. And we're going to see a lot of new issues as we go into the recovery and this focus on ESG. I think there's a real value, and for those GCs in the audience, to really spend quality time with the board chair and with the CEO and get a sense of their thinking of what perspectives, what should go on to the board agenda, what issues, which ones they think should be navigated and cadenced into board deliberations. And a GC with a strong relationship with the CEO can really help the CEO in coordinating those items for decisioning. Looking at strategic issues, obviously, and how they impact goals. Are there some issues which are part of a broader national board discussion? And can we take those issues off agenda but still address them maybe through education? Or are there issues that are current but don't need immediate attention, but they do need a standby Q&A, they need a risk plan, response plan, and the GC can help in building those. Now, my second focus under this topic as a GC is to see what can I do to support management. And I have two perspectives that I've put on my agenda as a GC. First is working to have better best practice management to board reporting. And I've identified that as a potential risk based on a recent NADC survey, which shows 56% of the respondents did not believe management material is sufficient to support an informed decision. And particularly now with so many new issues and a new landscape that is facing the board, I think this is of importance. And secondly, I would like to work with management to look at how they report ESG issues. Is there a common understanding of what issues need to be reported to the board or to the committee, and what compliance issues related to ESG need immediate reporting? And this comes about because of the recent Delaware court cases that are focusing on having the right informational systems and having accurate and reliable information going into the boardroom. My second big issue, no surprise, is really looking at risk and how do we manage risk in this new environment. As a general counsel, that's really one of my core responsibilities, is taking on the risk. So what can I do to support the board in prudent risk taking? That requires me as a general counsel to have systems in place, and I need to relook at those systems with this new strategy to give reliable risk reward information to the board. And really what that means is to, as the GC and working with the business team and the C-suite, to look at the risks that are associated with drivers of corporate performance and to take that information in a fashion to report to the board so they can make good, strong decisions, informed decisions. Now, I'm going to look at how we look at risk because many corporations missed that with the pandemic. So I think what couple of questions that I'm going to do is, what are the emerging risks? And looking at the risk interconnectedly, right? No longer just taking a heat map and looking at it siloed, but looking at the cascading effects of one risk like the pandemic that then cascaded into the supply chain. And with the ESG issues, another area is to, as the GC, is to bring the right people to the table. We may need to bring in different people to help identify those risks. And really to end the discussion, I'm going to just give a list of ESG risk that are facing. This is not a full list, but just to put them out there. Obviously, pay equity. You mentioned, return to work, managing the vaccine, health and safety issues, supply chain was a big risk that happened. Work board and workforce diversity. Cybersecurity always has remained and has really increased. And that should be a big focus right now because of the remote workforce. Climate change, even if you're not a company that is in the energy industry or in transportation, and changing customer demands.
So those are great points, and I think shows you what the challenge is that a board has or a company has today. And again, not only generated from the pandemic. I want to ask you specifically about another one that I consider a very sensitive topic and one where I think the GC can help. And that's where companies and boards decide to take a position on a social or a political issue. And I sort of look at this, I'm sort of glad I'm out of senior management and a board because this to me is like a public relations minefield. And when I look at, what the consideration is on taking a position on some of these social and political, there are a lot of risks. So talk to me about how a GC would help guide a board through this decision of whether they take a position or not on some of these issues.
You're absolutely right. I think the GC is core to addressing how to make a decision on responding. And your thoughts are really underscoring exactly what general counsel, C-suites, and boards across the country are confronting constantly. And really, it's whether you take an issue or not, and what are the associated risks with either option. And if the last few years have taught us anything, and particularly the pandemic, we are going to continue to have these types of events enter the zeitgeist constantly and without warning, particularly as we saw in this last year with the stakeholder focus on ESG and social inequities. We saw with increasing frequency corporations speaking out about current events that didn't appear to have a direct link to their bottom line, but did impact their reputation. And in making the decision for, I would say, for example, we could look at what happened in Georgia, right? And a number of Atlanta-based companies who made statements based on public outcry regarding the Georgia legislators' voting rights law. Now, making that decision really was not simple or straightforward. And we're seeing that these statements are having an array of outcomes. But what we're seeing is the statements that have negative outcomes are the statements that are not authentic and not accurate. So as a GC, what is my prescriptive to the CEO on how to tackle these initiatives? And really, it first comes down to creating a consistent decision-making process, because companies are going to face this on an ongoing basis, followed by crafting the message and then carrying the message out. And not only carrying it out, but really making sure it is implemented, a call to action. So I'm going to break down how I help the GC C-suite in navigating these issues. First and foremost, it is having the right members of management at the table. And that's going to depend on the corporation, and it's going to depend on the specific issue. But there are core team members. GC has to be one of those, right? Because you're going to provide the guidance on legal and regulatory challenges. But a key takeaway here is that the general counsel really adds value in this process because they can protect the deliberations under attorney-client privilege. And I think that's very significant. Now, what should be part of this decision-making process? There's a lot of factors, and it's not easy, particularly for a global company, to take a stance, right? To decide, am I going to do it or am I not going to do it? And I'm going to share an example to illustrate this point for the decision-making process. One CEO shared with me a tough decision they had to make in deciding to take a stance. Simultaneously, their stakeholders in Hong Kong were faced with actions that threatened their fundamental rights. And also in the United States, they had stakeholders who were dealing with police brutality, systematic racism. That CEO was faced with a choice. What do I do? Do I take a stance? Do I not take a stance? Do I respond to both? So what is the practical solution that C-suites have chosen? And what I recommend, again, I said a consistent process is a decision-making process. Two key questions as general counsel that clearly have to be answered in making the decision is, what is the relationship between taking a position and the company's articulated corporate purpose? Now, the C-suite's going to also have to look at, is this societal action so critical or counter to the company's core values that it requires the company to take a public stance? For example, following the January 6th insurrections, many corporations made a public statement that was 100% in support of an orderly democratic process. Again, the GC plays a critical role here when the company decides to take a position that they know is so counter to what they believe in. So, crafting the message. GCs will bring people to the table to look at, how is it authentic, is it accurate, and is it a clear reflection of the corporation's position? And does it align with actions the corporation has taken? if we reflect on some of the statements that were made by corporations in this last year, some issues that arose, did the political contributions of the corporation, did they align with the statement that was being presented? And GCs are really good at authenticating and validating the data that goes into the statement. Now, another big issue is really understanding the market. And corporations and C-suites need to understand the market on both sides. Value that I add as a GC in this regard, outside of just the traditional legal advice, is having the experience of making decisions, not just on legal regulatory, but looking at geopolitical issues, looking at ethical issues, looking at compliance issues. And so that's a value add to the conversation. Corporations are going to need to be prepared to isolate or alienate both sides. And if it's a strategic enough decision, stance the company wants to take, they may take that route. So what can we do there? A GC can help in a response plan and having responsive Q&As ready, understanding where the market might go and having a correct understanding. It's so important that the corporation really understand the market. I think this is really a bedrock to these decision-making teams, is to bring in consultants. A number of companies have gone so far as to bring in political pollsters to really help them understand what's going to be controversial, ultra controversial, and how their stakeholders will view the position that's being taken. Now, I can give an example where there's a complex decision to be made. One company used consultants to help them understand whether they would take a decision on police brutality, knowing that a number of their stakeholders and employees had family members in law enforcement. The other area that a GC brings, I think, value to the table is understanding the constituencies that are influencing the corporation and pressures that are being made, such as politicians and in the media. And then really it comes down to the action statement. That's the most important. A statement without evidence of real action is really going to have negative impact, as we've seen in some of the situations. And really just to wrap it up, it goes to, well, what's the board's role in this keystone discussion? Obviously, the CEO is going to articulate to the board what stance the company is going to take, and the board will look at it in its deliberations and look again at risk, the risk of taking action or not taking an action and the impact to the company.
Well, I think that's great insight and advice, Dawn, and it certainly shows that you have your finger on the pulse of what's happening both in the board members' responsibility and in the GC's responsibility to deal with all these events that have been occurring that impact companies. And I want to thank you for joining us. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.